Circle the correct answer. Objects become electrically charged as a result of transfer of protons, electrons, neutrons, or nuclear, for sure electrons, because electrons are the mobile particles and they are the free ones surrounding the nucleus. Rubbing a balloon through dry hair gives the balloon what? As a hint, I should give you which one has more tendency to lose electrons. So the hair has more tendency to lose electrons than the rubber. So it loses the electrons and becomes positively charged, while the balloon gains these electrons and become negatively charged. What happens when the rubber rod is rubbed with a piece of fur, giving the piece of fur a negative charge? So if the fur gained the negative charge, this means that it gained the electrons, and thus the rubber lost electrons. So electrons are added to the fur because it became negatively charged and now it has excess electrons. For the second exercise, fill in the following blanks with the words electrons or protons. Electrons are negatively charged while protons are positively charged. The protons reside in the nucleus. That's why they cannot be lost or gained. That's why in the above exercise we said no, or in the following exercise. So sorry, we're going to talk about it. And in the following exercise, we will be asked about which particles that are not included or not involved in the charging process. They are the protons because they reside in the nucleus of the atoms and are tightly bound to it. They will never leave an atom as a result of electrostatic procedure. Concerning electrostatic procedure or attraction and repulsion, protons could not leave the nucleus. Okay, but there are other processes that force the protons to come out of the nucleus, and these are known as the nuclear bombs and as such. Okay, so this is not related to our lesson, but electrostatically protons cannot leave the nucleus and be gained or lost by the atoms. On the other hand, electrons are located outside the nucleus and are easily removed from or added to atoms. As an object begins to gain or lose electrons from its atoms, it becomes negatively charged. So if it gains, it becomes negatively charged, and if it loses, it becomes positively charged, respectively. A negatively charged object has more electrons than protons, and a positively charged object has more protons than electrons. Now, exercise 3, you have to match. Conduction is the movement of electrons from one part of a conductor to another upon direct contact. So there are two conditions here that must be satisfied so that we consider the method of charging to be conduction. One point is that the two objects must be conductors, and the other point is that they must be in contact, otherwise conduction won't take place. Static discharge is an example of the shock from a doorknob is an example of static discharge, and I explained this before. It's like when we move on the carpet, we become a charge, we gain electrons. Then when we touch, our hand is a conductor and the doorknob is a conductor. So when these two conductors get in contact, in which my hand carry excess electrons, the electrons are going to jump from my hand to the knob, and thus let me feel this shock. Okay, so this is called static discharge because charges are jumping away from my hand. Conservation of a charge. So this states that the charges are not created nor destroyed. That's why I always repeat, like upon friction, if one body loses 10 electrons, the other one rubbed against it should gain the same number, which is 10 electrons. And we have static electricity. The whole lesson is about static electricity. So it is when you have a build-up of charges on an object, on the surfaces of the object. Electric field is the area around a charged object or the region around a charged object. Lightning is an example of electric discharge too, because clouds that carry excess electrons will lose them. The electrons will jump like to the ground, and lightning will be observed. Okay, just like the example of the doorknob. And the friction is an example of friction is when socks and the dryer build up charges through this process. So charging by friction is when we have two objects being rubbed against each other, and such that each one becomes a charge. One loses and the other gains electrons. Induction is the transfer of electrons by indirect contact. So it's like the example of the electroscope when we approach a rod to the knob without getting it in contact, causing repulsion or attraction of electrons and so on. Electric force, this was demonstrated when the fur of one piece of the cloth was attracted to the rod. Okay, you can go back to the activity of the course. Finally, exercise 4, a piece, or not finally, the exercise before the last one. A piece of polyethylene plastic pipe is rubbed against a piece of fur. By referring to the adjacent axis, showing an increasing order of tendency to lose electrons for different materials. Name the method of charging in this case, as long as we have rubbing. This means that this is a friction. Indicate the particles involved in this method of charging. Of course, the electrons, because they are the mobile free particles around the atom. Determine the sign of the netted charge acquired by each of the two objects. So you have to check here the axis of tendency to lose electrons. This is an increasing tendency to lose electrons. This means like rubber has more tendency to lose electrons than ebonite. So if rubber was rubbed against ebonite, then the rubber loses electrons while the ebonite gains them, and the rubber becomes positively charged while the ebonite becomes negatively charged. So for this example, we have plastic and fur. So let's compare the plastic and the fur. Plastic, which is the polyethylene, and the fur. So plastic has more tendency to lose electrons than fur. So plastic has more tendency to lose electrons than fur. Upon rubbing them against each other, the plastic loses a certain number of charges and becomes positively charged for having deficit electrons, while the fur gains the same number of electrons and becomes negatively charged for having excess electrons. Now indicate the particles that are not involved in charging. They are the protons. Explain, because they are enclosed within the nucleus of the atom. Finally, electroscope. Explain what happens in each case. Upon approaching a negatively charged rod to the knob of the electroscope, some electrons of the knob are repelled and move downward to accumulate on the leaves. The leaves thus have now excess electrons and become negatively charged, so they repel each other. However, in the second case, upon approaching a positively charged rod without putting it in contact with the rod, the electrons of the leaves are going to be attracted and they are going to accumulate on the knob. Okay? Accumulate on the knob. So now the leaves have deficit electrons and become positively charged, and having both the same sign, they repel each other. And finally, when a negatively charged rod is put in contact with the knob of the electroscope, we have conduction here. The electrons are going to jump to be conducted from the rod to the knob, and these electrons are going to flow and accumulate on the leaves, and thus the leaves become negatively charged. Having the same sign, they repel each other.